Good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Education Technology and Cengage webinar. My name's Charlie Rogers, I am the editor of Education Technology, and joining me today are representatives from Cengage and UCEM. So we have Andrew, Stuart and Karen. So guys, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Could you each just introduce yourselves quickly?
Sure, yes, thanks Charlie. I'm Andrew Robinson. I'm the Director for Higher Education for Europe, Middle East and Africa for Cengage. It's great to be here, thank you.
Hi, I'm Stuart Webster and I'm the Digital Solutions Manager for Cengage.
And I'm an academic facilitator, Karen Ullman from UCEM.
Thanks folks. So we're here today to talk about the Student Voices report from Cengage, and we are focusing on the 4 main problems that university students face when they go into higher education today. So first of all, Andrew, I wondered if you could just give us a little bit of background to the report, why you decided to commission it and so forth.
Sure, Charlie, yes. I mean, it is a Cengage report, but we actually had it commissioned by a market research agency because we were really interested to understand the student experience and how the student participates in the higher education learning journey that they go on, because obviously they're very much active participants now. Basically, the story of Cengage, as many of you will know, is that we have historically provided and continue to provide higher education materials for students and for educators. And traditionally, we've always looked at the educators as our kind of core audience, if you like, our core stakeholders. So those are the ones where we've addressed a lot of the requirements around making sure that the pedagogy and the content of our print and digital materials meets the academic requirements of those institutions and of those educators. But as you all know, I think increasingly now, students are becoming the key stakeholders as well in higher education. They are consumers, they are in many cases paying high tuition fees, which they're borrowing funds to do so, and they expect, obviously, as a result, a very positive, very enriching, but also from a utilitarian perspective, they want an outcome from their higher education, which is very positive in terms, usually, of jobs, in terms of employability after they've left. And so because that audience, that student audience, is so important, we wanted to make sure we got the voice of the student in this research to understand what their pain points were, understand what the issues were for students as they go through that higher education journey, that we as content providers and as providers of digital courseware and print materials can help support them with, and help support the educators to support the students as well. Sure. So we did the survey last year across a number of our sort of key markets, if you like, the UK, parts of Europe and in Africa and South Africa as well. And obviously what we'll be discussing this afternoon, hopefully, will be some of the conclusions that we found that were very important and interesting from the work that was done.
Fantastic, that's great. And Karen, so you're kind of on the front line of this as an educator, as an academic facilitator yourself at UCEM, and we've heard that student needs are changing. As Andrew just said, the environment that students are in now is very different than it may have been 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. So what have you seen in terms of changing student needs?
I mean, I think the first point, as Andrew said, is that now that we have students who are paying for their education, that there is a slight, I've paid my money, I want my degree, and we need to get students to understand that getting the end paper is part of a process, and how important that process is, and how much they will grow and learn through that process. And I think it's our job as educators to explain that process and explain the value in that process. Because also, if they just walked out with a piece of paper, then employers would be asking, well, what else have you learnt in your 3 years? And all those skills along the way are so important for making their employability so much a higher percentage chance of getting out there into the industry that they want. So it's important that we recognise that as educators, and we understand that, and we actually explain it to the students that this is a two-way journey that they will be going through. And the other side of them having to pay is obviously that many of them are now working much longer hours than they used to. They are now having to fund their living expenses as well. Grants for that have almost disappeared, and therefore there's a real strain on students, families of students, and all the kind of support network to make sure that they can actually get through their degree financially, and that makes them very time poor. You know, they want resources when they need them. They want to know that they are providing the answers for them at the time when they need them, and we've got to help them find those when they want them and when, say, time critical period in their study.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest things that is so time consuming about the university experience as compared to school is this independent learning. Right, and so your research has found that 38% of first year students you spoke to struggle with independent learning, and they find it makes it a very difficult transition from school to university. That's a huge jump, not a new jump, but as I understand it, something that has been scaled up over the past few years. Is that right?
Yes, certainly, and Stuart can speak to this a bit more probably, but I mean certainly it's not a new phenomenon, definitely, as you pointed out, Charlie. You know, obviously it's a big jump from school to university in terms of the whole way that education is delivered, and I'm sure maybe you want to explain some of the things that we've observed from that side.
Yeah, and I think there is a big jump. I think also that jump has exponentially got bigger because there are just ever increasing numbers of young people going to university, and therefore we're 40 or 50% of a group of 18-year-olds, for example, are going to university. That gap in experiences has really changed and has grown. And I think it is incumbent both on companies like Cengage in the kind of tools and content that we deliver, as well as working with educators, of thinking about how do we make that transition as painless as possible. And there's a huge piece there. So that looks at the kind of content we're delivering and the way that content is structured, whether it's written content, whether it's video or simulated materials, but also thinking about how we guide students through it. And I think one of the key pieces is, as well as creating these resources and this material, is working with educators and understanding how does digital fulfill part of that overall learning experience, that learning journey? The stuff that digital just doesn't do well, and at this stage just isn't built to do, and there are areas where it can really take on some of the burden of the work and can fill those gaps and can really support students in becoming more independent learners, and frees up time for the educators to do the bits that really need focusing on that maybe a digital resource can't do so well. So I think it's a collaborative piece. It's certainly something that as Cengage we've learned from talking to the students and understanding what their concerns are, but also what kind of resources they want to use, which is also in the research, but then working with educators on how do we structure that to be the most effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's part of the fact that obviously the student body that's coming into the university sector, as Stuart's mentioned, across all of our different regions and geographies, are coming from a much more diverse background, where perhaps they're the first person in their family to go to university. They're not exposed to the sort of the routines of what studying for a university degree means and how different it is from school. So that's where I think the traditional issue of that jump has always been there, but it's just been exacerbated in recent times because of the fact that higher education has expanded so much and so quickly, and of course the student numbers at these institutions has gone up very quickly as well, which again has placed additional pressure on the educators just at the time when there are far more students there who aren't used to or haven't been sort of familiarised in any way with that type of learning, with independent learning.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes students don't realise that they don't know about independent learning until some educators are going, well, now you're at university, you've got to be an independent learner, and they don't actually know what that entails.
What that means.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've been in school all my life and I've done loads of learning, so why now is it different?
Yeah.
And I think it's our job in universities to actually help them transition into their induction and actually explain what it does mean and explain where the resources are, and that people will be sending you to resources, and you've got to come back and you've got to say what went well, what went wrong, actually self-diagnose, what do I do next, and actually think about those skills. And hopefully by the time they get to year 3, if they've done that, then they are true independent learners when it really counts in doing their dissertation. So we can't just assume that because they say they're struggling, they really know what it is when they get there. And I think it's really important for us to scaffold that learning in ways of showing them where those resources are and how good they are and what a difference they make. So, it's no good just sending them to resources. You've actually got to prove their worth. So, a student that did this, managed to get through the first month and managed to find the library and managed to, be able to know what a report looks like and use the resources. So I think it's really important for us to not just leave them until they finish and then go, well, I didn't really get that whole independent thing and now I haven't been very successful.
Yeah.
We need to explain what independent learning means.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That's good, because when they leave school, they've done homework and they think, well, homework
Yes.
is independent. Well, it's actually very, very different in higher
Yeah.
education,
Yes.
isn't it? So that's definitely the transition they see the most challenging, I think.
Yeah, and showing them that tangible difference as well, that these resources can make
Yes.
to their experience.
Yes, absolutely.
Showing them a real world impact of it
Yes.
is certainly important. We've actually had a few questions come in from our audience already, and just to let you know, there is still time for you to send in questions. If you have any for our panel, please do use the Q&A format function to send them through, and I will do my best to address them to our panel. So our first question is about support and development strategies in terms of digital resources. So are there strategies that have been implemented at UCEM, for example, that have worked particularly well for you?
My role is quite a new role. We trialled it last semester. So UCM is 100% online, so we don't have any students on campus. So it's really important that our students know that we are human, that there is an AI involved in our courses, and that they have that contact. We, on every module now, we have a subject specialist and then a study specialist, which is the academic facilitator. And my role, I've got loads of resources because we are online, is to actually flag post those resources and make sure that students are using them. So I will be going on the VLE, I will be making sure that they're engaging with the VLE. If they're not, then they get a phone call and we find out why. And often some real kind of minor issues will come out from that conversation, and you can just kind of step them on to the next stage, or you can send them off and say, I'll ring you up in a week and see how you got on with that. And therefore we're getting that independence kind of coming through by sending them off, making them reflect on what they've done, and then bringing it back to somebody who can then add them onto the next stage. And then you find that reflection happens automatically, and then they feel comfortable and they take themselves off. So it's just that scaffolding. Some people need it personally, some people need it on the VLE in terms of the instructions. But I think that is the key to how we can help the students.
So your digital tech is almost facilitating that human connection that you've got with your students.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not about me teaching them how to write reports. So I'm not going to spend a couple of hours on the phone. It's going away saying, look at that resource there.
Yeah. Have
a go, see how, write a report about buying apples or whatever,
Yeah.
and send it to me, and then we'll have a discussion about it and see how you feel about it.
Fantastic.
So it's all about sending them to the resources so that next time when they're in the same situation, they know the resources are there and then they use them. Instead of always coming back. So, making them.
And I think we try to perform a complementary role in that process.
Absolutely.
Obviously, with the educators leading it in the terms of the digital solutions that we have through Stuart's team and the team we have within the Cengage organisation to help give that kind of pre and post implementation training, so help to support educators and students so that they can help navigate some of the products, whether they're ebooks or whether they're full courseware, once they're being used. Because obviously the biggest frustration from our side is when the tools aren't being used, and that sometimes is because not everybody is as comfortable as they would like to be, or would want to acknowledge that they're not comfortable as they'd like to be in using them. So we wanted to be there to supply that support, which actually in some ways is as important, if not more important, than the tools themselves, because if they don't have the training and understanding and confidence to use them, then they don't get used, and then we all kind of lose out, particularly the student at the end of the day, with the educators.
Because you've got to have that loop. You've got to, if you're sending a student to the resource, you've got to know that they've used it, they've interacted with it, but also that they've learnt something from it. So you've got to check. So lots of the resources have that check in there, but as educators we have to go, let's check that have they actually learnt from it. It's all very well, we can all log on today, but have we learnt anything from it?
Absolutely. As educator, as curator of those resources, of that knowledge.
Absolutely, yes.
I think also making sure, certainly from an educator's perspective, that educators are as time poor as the students is.
Yeah.
From a digital perspective, making sure that however you're delivering those digital resources, so from Sengage's perspective, certainly knowing Karen and the way that UCEM work is making sure that we can integrate with the systems that they're using already,
Yeah.
and that is as fluid and there's as little friction as possible. And I think that's true for educators anywhere, is that the students need to have a relatively smooth experience, there's some learning to go on there, but that should be the same for educators as well. So whilst we can drive those analytics and deliver that content, it needs to be done in a way that is sympathetic to whatever else is going on campus, and that's kind of key. And whether that's a VLE becoming the digital hub of everyone's experience, or if they're doing it in a self-built environment, but that's kind of key. It's having all of these pieces sat in different places and not having them communicate just creates as many challenges as it does solve problems. So I think that integration and having a kind of holistic approach to these things really works.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads in quite well actually to another question we've had from an audience member. So I know Cengage, you work, as you've mentioned, across the globe, and someone has asked, what online programs have you created or are you developing that will help students, particularly that come from a rural secondary school environment, and enable them to adapt into university culture?
Okay, I guess there's two parts to that. So certainly from our global perspective, we see lots of examples from students who come from rural backgrounds and may not have experience when they come to university, often in urban settings, of even using a computer. And that's certainly not rare in some of the parts of the world. So looking at how do we quickly, and again with as little friction as possible, build up their experience of what is a computer, how do I use it, how do I engage with it, and then stepping up from there, thinking about software packages that they might be using during their studies. So we've got digital solutions that take them through that process. So guided learning in conjunction with educators that will take them through from the very, very basics of what is a computer through to being able to use Word, PowerPoint and Excel. And I think when we're thinking about those packages, and certainly the numbers of students that often go through them, this isn't a taught course in most universities, and making that process as student focused and student centric as possible, to the point of having audio tracks that go along with the learning as well as visual tracks. Students can sit and learn and go through that process with relatively limited contact time, but also having assessment in there and the analytics that Karen talked about to make sure that they are actually progressing and making those steps forward. So I think that's kind of key. I think the other side of it is also looking at resources that students who are still living in rural areas and don't have permanent internet access to, is making sure that material is downloadable. So whether it's about being able to download an ebook or download video material, but I think both of those sides are areas that we focused on and deliver solutions for them, and certainly address those challenges. So whether you're going into an urban sort of higher ed environment, you need to upskill, whether you're still in a rural area or whether you've got a combination of both, which is quite common too. But certainly we have solutions around them, and it's something that we're constantly looking at and trying to understand, where do we go next, or as internet becomes more available in those rural areas, how do we make sure that with regards to bandwidth, which can be expensive and limited in these areas, is how do we deliver low bandwidth solutions to make sure that students can engage with contemporary tools without too many challenges.
And that is key from an educator's point of view, because when you look at trying to educate a level first year, for example, but you know that the vast difference in what the student's bringing, that there isn't this level playing field. And I think, if you are in the UK, you probably take that quite for granted. We know that there's disadvantages around, but we're very kind of aware of that, and when you talk about people not having a computer up to the age of 18, that is a real problem if you've got people who've been using them all their life and you're trying to teach across a course. So these kind of solutions are key in those kind of areas.
And I think we have solutions. I mean, as Stuart has mentioned, for specifically around computer skills and end user computing skills, if you like, which addresses those areas. But also, to your point, Karen, I think literacy. We have specific products as well for literacy and numeracy to get everybody to that same playing field. That certainly applies in the Middle East markets, for example, where getting to a level of English, because they're delivering their courses in English, and of course they're often Arabic or non-English speakers, so there's a need for that kind of foundation level course to get everyone to the same playing field. And in places like South Africa, where some matric students won't be as the same level of attainment as others, particularly in maths and numeracy, again, the products that we have in those areas help to get everyone to a level playing field. And as Stuart says, what that really helps educators with is that those courses can work with a relatively light touch in terms of the number of educators per student, and the student numbers tend to be big, and then of course that really helps with the outcomes for those students when they get onto their specialist degree program, because if they start at that disadvantage in year one, they're going to be playing catch up for the whole way through their undergraduate careers. So it's really important, and that's one of the areas where I think we've invested a lot, particularly with our SAM product, which is our end user computing one, as well as with the numeracy and literacy. And the biggest challenge is usually the technology infrastructure, making sure there is the bandwidth and there are the devices and hardware to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to be this kind of personalised approach to students, and making sure that they're all comfortable coming from whatever background they've come from, to sit as one level together and learn from the same point. Viewers just sent in a question asking what the best practical way to bridge that gap would be. I think you've all touched on that pretty well already. But is it that personalisation, that understanding that students will come from different backgrounds?
I think first you've got to kind of understand where what level your students are at.
Yeah.
You then need to identify their needs.
Yeah.
And digital solutions are excellent at filling those gaps in those areas. And then again, talking about the loop, making sure that they are actually engaging with it, that they are actually learning from it, and constantly seeing whether they're up to the same standards. So, it does need monitoring. You can't just go, here you go, here's your login,
let it go.
Enjoy, and I'll see you in 6 months' time. You do have to make sure that you're constantly monitoring and making sure that they are actually going to actually improve and get those skills to their right level.
Yeah. And I think certainly with resourcing as well, I mean, the personal one-to-one touch is what's wanted, where certainly there are courses that Cengage are involved in where we are talking about 5, 6, 7, 8,000 first-year students who need supporting, that realistically nobody has a structure that allows that to happen in a one-to-one way. So it's helping identify relative levels of skill and then delivering programs that address at the appropriate level. Is it totally personalised? No, certainly not at this stage, but it does allow the students to get a level of support and help, and certainly within the context of the realities of the number of educators who are available. So I don't think it's a perfect solution, and one of the great things about technology is it's constantly progressing, is looking at what is it we're doing now, how does that work, what are the outcomes that we see from it, and those touch points, and where are we getting to, and taking those steps forward. So I think certainly we are in a better place using technology than we probably ever have been before, but is there still a long way to go that helps us to address these challenges in a much more personal way, certainly. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a practical start though, which I think
and we have and these technologies can do the diagnosis, as you were saying, of where the gaps are to start with. As we've discussed already, I think the idea with our technology is not to replace what the educators are doing, it is to enhance and complement it. So it's where we can make sure the technology, as Stuart was saying, is optimized to do that. And so that whilst we're not having enabling a personal face-to-face contact situation to take place, we're hoping indirectly facilitating that, because some of the analytics and diagnostics are based on that student's performance.
And some of these kind of lower skills that we need to get everyone ready for could be mentored by year threes. There's no reason why that couldn't work really well using.
And that happens actually in some of the settings we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that quite common.
So it doesn't have to be on the subject specialist or the learning developer. It can actually come from student to student, so peer support.
So use what you've got at your disposal and work from there. Great. And the second point that the research threw up, other than the independent learning, was the fact that 31% of third-year students actually find interpreting and interacting with data one of the biggest problems that they have at university, and one of the most challenging aspects of of the course, especially as things get more complex. So how can universities support students in that? Obviously, the course will change over the course of 3 or 4 years, however long they're there. But the more complex elements, is there a way that universities can work to help that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure Karen will speak to how universities can help with the interpretation of the data side, because I think that's a very important role the educators have to play in that. In terms of what we can do, providing the digital resources to support the sort of data analytics, bear in mind that the survey itself and a large constituency of the students that we deal with in Cengage are in the sort of social science disciplines, they're in kind of the sort of business and economics areas, and there's a requirement for them to be pretty numerate and pretty literate with quantitative data, basically. And often the challenge there is they won't have been exposed to that kind of maths, basically, for a number of years at school, if they were at all. So they come, as to our point earlier, at a level where maybe they do have to really get their confidence and competence back in just working through mathematical concepts and making sure they understand regression analysis or whatever it happens to be they need for their statistics programs. So I think that's where we can come in to help get them to the right place, so they feel confident with the data. And then, I mean, Karen, I'm sure you can speak more to the interpretation part, which I think is much more of a critical thinking skill.
Because that critical analysis is difficult for students. We kind of educate them to have a one set answer. We put them through their exams at school, and you know there is an answer that they're almost trained to give. You get this question, you give this answer, and we need to kind of break that mold by the time they come to university, because we are saying, given the data, you can come out, depending on how you interpret it, with your facts backing that up, you can come out with different answers, and they can all be right because you will have backed that with the facts that you have found. And what, as educators, we need to do that bit, but if we're spending time going through all the statistical data and explaining how to manipulate the numbers and actually get the information that you're required to start with, then that is a whole chunk of time when you could actually be going through the interpretation, which is really key in that last year when people are doing their dissertation, they're thinking about their own personal projects and their own personal data, and therefore they are having to independently come out with solutions, conclusions from what they're looking at. And you know, in a setting where we're all doing the same subject, it can feel quite comfortable, but in a dissertation it can feel quite lonely and quite daunting. And we have to give them the confidence to say, if you're saying that, back it up, tell us why, and that's excellent. That's what we want to know, the why.
And that's an important life skill.
Absolutely.
I mean, for any discipline, whether you're in business studies and economics, and needing to look at that numeracy data and look at it from that mathematical point of view, or even as you said there, Karen, about more general information literacy and knowing how to back up an argument and to decipher.
And I think what we need to do is use different tools. So you know, we will talk about it at UCM. We'll do a webinar. We will have resources on it. We will create kind of H5P so they can kind of have a formative idea of how they're doing, and it's catching everyone with the different resources, and digital solutions is part of that package. It's a jigsaw learning. You learn it through lots of different ways, and we've got to teach our students that, because when they go out into the big wide world on their own, they will be getting information from different sources, and they need to know which one is valuable and which one isn't.
Absolutely. And what role are the digital resources playing in that? Obviously the role of the educator there is essential in guiding students through, and there are obviously digital resources that can help with the actual numerical data analysis. But are there digital resources that can maybe marry the two approaches that can help students with their critical thinking?
There are. I think the educator is still the critical player in developing critical thinking skills. I think as one of the main sort of transferable outcomes, if you like, when we go back to that pragmatic, what do you want to come away from university with in terms of skills for employability. But in terms of the tools that we have that can help enable that to some extent, for example, within business studies and economics, case studies. So case studies is a kind of, again, information literacy piece where there is no right answer to a case study necessarily, but it's about absorbing that data, whether it be qualitative or quantitative actually, and then making an interpretation which you can then justify with the empirical evidence that's there. So those kind of skills can be developed using the digital platforms that we have. On the quantitative side, it's about sort of practicing those mathematical concepts I mentioned earlier, but in a safe environment, so a low stakes environment where you can go through, make lots of mistakes, and what will happen is the tool will point you to the part of the text or the asset or the material that helps you again reinforce an understanding of that concept, and then you can practice again. And then you can practice again. So it's like the whole sort of golf driving range type thing where you're in that safe environment and you can keep practicing those concepts until you're comfortable with them. And that applies definitely to the qualitative to some extent as well as the quantitative disciplines. So hopefully that's what we try to do with the tools. But again, you know, that is the first step and the first parts of the scaffolding, and then it moves over to the educator to really help to do some more applied work to make that real for the student.
Well, as well as helping the students directly, that digital resources can help the educator structure their approach, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, okay. And one of the next things that the Student Voices report found was that students, unsurprisingly,
they don't like exams, do they?
They don't, no.
Okay.
They don't like them,
really.
and they find them stressful. And quite often, they're just not quite sure how to approach being as prepared as they can for these assessments. Any of us that have gone through a test or an exam will know the feeling of being utterly terrified. But also maybe not sure what is out there to help you get to the point you need to be as confident as possible when you walk through those doors to do whatever your assessment might be. So is there more that universities can be doing then to help students have that confidence, as much confidence as they could be expected to have before their assessment?
I think we do need to prepare students in advance. The only reason I bet half of those 32% said challenging for me was preparing for an assessment was because they didn't understand what a good assessment looks like. So there is that fear factor which instantly happens, and you almost don't understand the goal. So you might understand the process, but you don't actually understand where the finish line is. And we have to let them know what a good assessment looks like, what a good exam answer looks like. We need to model that, and we need to show them ways through of getting that answer, and that can be digital solutions. So for example, if one of the assessments is to write a report, then if we've got a tool to show them how to write a report and practice that, then we can go, if you go over there and learn that, come back, bring what you know, and this is a student who hasn't done it in report format and the mark they got. This is a student who has done it in the right format, and look at the mark they've got, and look how clear the information is, and look how clearly we can see what conclusions they came to and what recommendations they made. And you can actually show that to the student, and that just gives them confidence and going, right, so that is the route I need to go to, and this is how I get there. And it needs to happen way before we're talking almost about assignments, because at that point it's too late, because all they're thinking about is the content of what I'm writing, as opposed to how I'm going to write it and how I'm going to prepare for it, and have I actually thought about how I'm going to plan and allow time for that. So I think it's part of that understanding. We might have to take a short-term kind of loss on the content for a part of our lecture. We might have to get the learning developers involved and say, this is how we do it. You'll need this in 6 weeks' time, but we're going to tell you now, so you've got plenty of time to work through all these resources. And if you're having problems, you've got time to come back to us and let us know. This is where you go. So whether it's us, this is where you go online, or who you contact. Same with face-to-face. This is your learning developer team. Go and see them, your student support, and give them time to work through the assignment. So whether that's producing in term, or whether it's an exam at the end, when do we teach them how to do an exam? Right until weeks before they're about to go in. Let them have time to actually take that information on board and actually think about it, process it, so that actually they're ready for when that time comes.
And giving them that tangible example as well as what they're aiming for.
So important.
Can calm them down quite a lot.
I think I mean, Karen's bit sounds really exciting. I want to go and study at UCM. Sport's fantastic. And I think you're right. I think that is that key bit, is understanding what do good examples look like, what the good questions. I think from Cengage's side, and certainly the digital side, is more around the content piece, but is allowing students to build their confidence. So whilst they're understanding that structure, whilst they're understanding what those good examples look like, is how do I make sure I've got the understanding of the content that's going to build into that. So allowing them to test themselves and to get feedback, and those kind of things have been around for a while, but as Andrew talked about earlier, also redirecting them back to those learning tools and resources that they use. So whether it's written content, there's video material, but creating that loop. Karen talked earlier about that cycle of providing the feedback and then providing access to additional resources that help fill those gaps, and allowing them to assess themselves again. And something that it came out in the research, and it comes out a lot when we talk to students in general, is that opportunity to practice. And it varies from discipline to discipline area, and certain groups of students absolutely are all over practice and they want as much opportunity as possible to practice. Other areas less so. But I think it's key, and it kind of builds into those two pieces. There is no point in having all the content knowledge if you don't know how to structure it and deliver it. I would say equally so, even understanding what a great answer looks like without that content piece. But I think together they work really well. As I said earlier, there's bits that digital do well. They do that content piece well. They do that feedback and that learning loop well. They would struggle at the moment to do lots of the stuff that Karen talked about. But they glue together quite nicely.
And you can do this at all levels. So in the first year, it might be more about kind of getting those structures involved. But in the final year, when we're looking at what we've just talked about, the analysis of data and critical appraisal we're doing at the moment, we're kind of showing them a good and bad answer and highlighting what made that critical analysis great and what made that description not so great. And you can physically see the difference in a worked example. So you know, the students understand this could be a question they might get in the exam, and therefore that's not so great. Why is that better? What is it that, and we can discuss that, and we can actually kind of go through it, and then if they're still having problems, then we can send them away to different resources. So.
That's really interesting to see that difference between that sort of technique you need to use for assessments and exams at higher education versus school, where it's just very specifically, if the field question comes up, this is what you write.
Absolutely.
Which is obviously very different.
And it helps with that independent learning as well, that if they know how to approach a question rather than just parroting out an answer they've been told to learn, then it's much better skill to have.
If you've given somebody the confidence to go forward, then they're going to independently do that.
And again, that's a real world application. That's what we do at work all the time, is try and find our own answers to things through.
I mean, the interesting thing is, probably one of the most challenging things now about assessments, as we were just talking about before the broadcast, was that is the handwriting of students and handwriting generally. Because obviously one of the things that we've explored, and it hasn't come to fruition on a large scale yet, although some of the viewers might be aware of it, has been the kind of high stakes testing using technologies to actually write the exams on computers and devices, because of course that's quite one of the interesting areas of higher ed. Is a lot of the activity now for us, all of us in the workplace or in education, is on devices, and then the only scenario when we're writing a lot, apart from if we still do Christmas cards or whatever, is writing an exam. So, you know,
which is the most stressful way to write.
So perhaps we should also be getting them to practice their handwriting a bit as well. We don't have the software for that.
I don't know whether we've got digital solution.
And that is a transitional piece. If you look at somewhere like Sweden, they do, so they're equivalent to, I guess, A levels at 18. And last year they moved to a completely online model, and their students are now en masse doing those exams in a digital environment. And it's a very early stage, and it's only a single country, but you start to see that transition and that recognition of, whilst we look at all of the areas that students are struggling with, the idea that you would say to a student, it's perfectly fine, you can bring your laptop into lectures, you can do all of this stuff all the way through the year, and you get to, as you say, the most important point in the year, and suddenly go, by the way, that device you've been using. And I think that's one of the key bits as we move into this digital world, is it's constantly a case of reviewing what are we doing and how are we doing it, and looking at why. And from a student's perspective, how does this look? And that's not to say that always what the students want is right, but if you're going to allow them to do something for 11 and a half months a year, suddenly in the last 2 weeks when they're doing their exams, to say, oh, actually you can't do that anymore. Seems
at UCM we are moving away from paper-based exams completely. So
It is
in
being
the next 2
trialled.
years,
Yeah.
everything
That's
will be
interesting.
computer-based.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it. Reports from across the country and certain universities trialling bringing a computer into the exam. So quite possibly
Watch the space.
handwriting, will be an issue going forward. So, talking about typing and handwriting, there's an efficiency there. Right? There's a way to make something the most efficient way to get through a project or an exam. And as we talked about earlier, however nice it would be to be able to just learn whatever you wanted for the experience of learning, which is important. We have to look at the practicalities of higher education now, and largely students are going through higher education in order to become more employable. That's the ROI for them. That's the point of paying these high tuition fees, is the fact that they will be able to go confidently into a job at the end of it. And part of that is the fact that they do want efficient learning. And students love working with tech, but at the same time, one-to-one is irreplaceable. So how can those two things work together? How can we marry an efficiency of learning with that personalised one-to-one approach?
Okay.
If I just go to the one-to-one approach support, I really feel that quite often when a student is asking one-to-one, it's more about reassurance than personalised tutoring.
Sure.
So they're not wanting to sit down and talk about their content. They're just wanting to check that their learning is okay. And quite often it could be a kind of a call for other types of pastoral help. So we do have to be aware of that. I think from a UCM point of view, when we're 100% online, we use our forums, and we can have students that have like 30 years plus experience in the industry and now are kind of converting it into a qualification. And so lots of the times our tutors will be hands off on the forums, and we might get students saying to us, but why hasn't my tutor answered me? Because 7 or 8 other people have a wealth of knowledge have answered you. All you have to do is take note of what they've said and actually use that. And the benefit of peer-to-peer support and valuing your other students, because that's what we do at work. You know, we don't always go to our manager, we talk to our colleagues and we get their advice. And I think that's really important to kind of show students that you can get support from your peers. It can feel quite daunting because you do feel like you want to be supported by the leader, if you like. But it's so valuable to be looking at peer support as well.
And again, it's a confidence thing. You might not want to admit that maybe you don't know something and someone else on your course does, but again, that's life. That's work, that's our personal lives. We have to rely on each other and learn in a peer-to-peer environment.
And I think that the point that the report brought up about sort of this need for sort of an efficient way of learning speaks to a couple of things. I mean, first, an interesting point on the sort of the geography of the different feedback we got in the report is the countries where there don't tend to be very high tuition fees or none at all, it was much more about education for education's sake. Whereas the countries where there was a high tuition fee or level of borrowing required to go through the programme, it was very much a utilitarian approach. I want an outcome, which is, you know, employability at the end of the day. And I think that does lend itself in those contexts to that sort of very sort of strategic learning approach, a very pragmatic learning approach, for the reasons that we discussed earlier around the fact that students are very time poor, they're trying to hold down a job to bring income, they may have families. Obviously the student body is diverse in lots of different ways in terms of age as well as the sort of background, and that means that people are studying and trying to combine it with lots of other parts of their lifestyle. In fact, in the US we did a lot of work on that when we were building some of these programs initially, to acknowledge the fact that people were doing assessments between midnight and 2 a.m. rather than at the usual times that one would expect. So we're certainly very sort of cognizant of the fact that this kind of need is there for students to have that flexibility. Hopefully, with what sort of programs that you're delivering at UCM and what we're doing, we are facilitating that, because a lot of these students are mature students or are doing other things at the same time. So, you know, for us that was a really interesting observation, I guess. as with some of the other conclusions we've discussed this afternoon, it's helped to us to validate and position what we're doing as well as a direction of travel, because obviously, just for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning about we don't want to make too many assumptions about students. As you know, some of us were students a long time ago. Well, I was anyway. So obviously I can't transpose an experience of the 1980s into what's going on now. So I think that from that perspective, it's been really useful to really understand what it means by efficient ways of learning. But it is about being quite tactical as well about how they do their
because
learning, where they're doing
also,
learning.
sorry, Anne, I didn't mean to interrupt. Efficient can be taken in two ways. So, efficient for one student could be like, I get from A to B, I pass, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But actually, efficient to an educator could be a few bumps along the road. And sometimes, as an educator, I like my students to fail and learn, because I feel that's a really key exercise in life, if not even learning, and it makes them more independent and resilient to things that come along. So a student might look at that and go, well, that's not very efficient, you send me down this track and now I've got to turn all the way back and go and find somewhere else. And sometimes we need to actually tell them why we are doing this.
Right, give them some context.
Yes. So you'll go through this, going back to the 80s, I used to do an online case study with my business studies student. They used to hate it because their companies went down, and I'd suddenly put in a great big economic downtime, and they'd be like, I hate this, what are you making me do? But afterwards, when we kind of unpacked everything, they absolutely found it the most enriching learning event. And I think sometimes we don't do enough to say to our students, it's fine, you are going to learn X, Y, Z from doing this. Don't worry, we're here, we're holding your metaphorical hand through this. And they may not see it as the most efficient way, I just want to be told the answer and off I go. But actually what they will learn to their future studies will be enormous.
And like you say, that's a life skill. Life goes wrong.
It does.
And if you can deal with it, then you're...
And I think that's where the one-to-one support is important as well, isn't it? And we were talking a bit earlier again about some of the challenges around mental health for students these days. And obviously all the pressures we've talked about in the last half an hour or so sort of drive in that direction. And clearly, hopefully with some of the tools that we have that take that some of the pressure away from educators in delivering some of the knowledge does free up the time to do some of the pastoral, that hand-holding that you mentioned that needs to be done from time to time. And clearly that seems to have resonated in some of the feedback we got on the report as well.
Fantastic. Again, it's that balance of using digital resources to help buoy what educators are already doing. To allow you more time to do what you need to do.
Absolutely.
It's a support mechanism in effect. I mean, and it's one of those interesting pieces that when I first started going out talking about digital resources 6 or 7 years ago, there's initially this fear factor of people going, you're trying to steal our jobs.
Of course. And it's still a conversation that educators are having now.
I am sure there are people watching right now. And absolutely, it's not that. It is. I have not visited a university yet where everybody goes to, we've got plenty of staff and loads of money and all the time. Everything is absolutely awesome. But thanks for calling. That was nice for you. That everybody's looking for a way of how do we more effectively use time, provide support for students in the best way. And there are those things, as we said, that digital...
Stuart, you can have that part of my job. So I can do the great stuff. I can do the one-to-one and making sure that they use those resources.
And absolutely. And I think it is, that's where we are at the moment. There's those resources provided. And I can't imagine that's going to change. I love technology. The reality is it's not human. It's never going to be human. It doesn't think like humans. It certainly doesn't have the emotional context that comes with it. So it fits a place, it fills a gap. And unless suddenly every university in the world gets a massive funding boost and lots of new staff and all those wonderful things, it has that place that it fits nicely. And Andrew
has a role to play.
Absolutely. And as Andrew was saying earlier, when you look at sort of from an economic side, you've got students who are going to university because they want to study something, and we saw that particularly somewhere like Germany, for example, in the survey. That's what we saw from them. And in the UK, it's about I'm going for a functional reason. But the digital resources still fill gaps because students in Germany go, I want to practice and practice and practice because they're there because they love that subject and they want to be great at it. And that might be a different reason in the UK, but it doesn't change the requirement to have something there to provide that support. And it's one of those nice pieces where you kind of go, well, let's look at why you're using it or why you think you need to use digital and how that fits in, rather than just going, here's the thing, there you go, we'll drop it in there and everything's going to be fine. And providing that training and support both to
Absolutely.
educators as well as students is key to that.
Yeah, and looking at the analytics to make sure that they're using it in the correct way and not just giving up. So, you know, it is about kind of monitoring them with that. But I mean, in this 24/7 age that we've got, you know, I work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5.
Yeah.
You're
You're not there at 2 in the morning when they're completing their assessments.
You have to be up at 1 a.m. on a Sunday/Monday because they're going to hand that paper in and they need you to be there.
Yeah.
I get the emails.
But I mean, from an educator perspective, what we see not only the fact that resources are so tight for educators and for institutions, but actually, as we've discussed as well, or certainly touched upon, students as consumers, there's an expectation for things in the UK like the National Student Survey or the TEF proxies that are used to measure, in theory, I put that in inverted commas, the efficacy of higher education teaching. You know, these things are creating additional challenges for educators as well. And again, we are trying to use these tools to enable those high quality, if you like, interactions happen between educators and students, and let some of the other stuff happen, you know, through the technologies that we have.
Take a bit of that lower bureaucracy or admin out,
and it adds the data sets as well, of course, if they're relevant, which you know, can help quantify things.
Let the humans do what only humans can do.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. Fantastic. So we only have a few minutes left. I've just been told by our producer backstage, but we do have some questions from our audience, if that's okay. So I'm just going to pose those to you now. How effectively do you think students self-evaluate their own skills, and what do we do with students with no problems, in inverted commas?
Wow.
I mean, I'll jump in first. I mean, simply because I've just come back from a business trip where I was talking about exactly that with the particular instructor. And in their example, it was a very specific set of skills around computer literacy. Of the students' intake every year, they get told, the students come in, no, I can do that. I already know how to use that particular software package or whatever. They have a carte blanche rule that everybody has to go through an exemption test. 90% of students fail.
Wow.
It's only a very small snapshot of students, but in that example, and that's consistent. So over the last, we've been working with them for 5 or 6 years, and they've had the same policies in place. And every year, students come in, no, I'll do the exemption test because I don't need to do that particular module. And consistently, it's a 90% fail.
Wow.
So in that example, certainly, what students think they know or think they need to know to be able to fulfill that part of the course is certainly sort of doesn't come up to standard at all.
We work with professional bodies, and one of the parts that all the professional bodies we work with want is a reflective practitioner. And in schools, students don't have to reflect. They're told what they need to do to get through to the system. So I think we have to, again, I keep using the word scaffold, but we have to give them templates to actually fill in. So one of the things that we do at UCM is after their first assignment, they get a sheet that they have to fill in. So they look at their strengths, their weaknesses, what their feedback said, what they think they could improve on, what they think that they're doing really well, and how they can take that to their next assignment. And then we can go through that if they want to kind of unpack it anymore. Some of our students that take their first assignment but fail get a phone call from an academic support staff, and we'll go through that feedback. So it's not just going, well, this said this, so what do we think about that? It's actually going, well, what's that mean to you, and how do you move it forward? But I don't think they're ever going to come into university and go, do you know what, I'm really reflective. I really understand where I'm going with this. I haven't ever met a student like that. I'm sure some of them exist, but I haven't met them. So I think we do need to give them some tools to be able to do that. And I think the problem with people that go, oh, I've got no problem, I think you have to get them to justify what they mean by no problem. And that's why we created this tool to reflect. So you have no problem, but what does that mean?
And I think the tools that we have can assess and self-evaluate students on their knowledge and and what they know and what they've acquired through the content that we have. But it would be a false self-evaluation for them to assume that therefore they're able to apply the concept. So again, it's a complementary thing.
Yeah.
You know, we can give them some confidence probably because they've self-evaluated their knowledge, but hopefully that's not false confidence, because that's not going to necessarily equip them to pass the assessments we were talking about before.
To apply it, yeah, sure. And we sort of touched on this earlier, but have you engaged peer students from higher years to encourage first year students to properly use e-resources? So we did talk about the importance of peer-to-peer learning earlier. Do you think that helps in directing students towards
it's something that we're looking at the moment, because we are all completely 100% online. We do not see our students as such, so it's very difficult to get a feel of how they can do that. But we are looking at some mentoring schemes, but also we're looking at something called the Digital Ambassador Scheme. Okay. So this is following on from Fiona Harvey's iChamps. So apologies that Fiona couldn't make it today, but I'm sure she's listening online. So she started this at Southampton, but it's basically finding students who have a real kind of love of digital, actually putting them through creating an e-portfolio to show, you know, all their skills that they've gained, and then kind of testing out new products for us, and actually speaking to student bodies and going, you know, this is really great and this is how we use this, and actually being an ambassador across all courses. But they would be self-selected, so they would decide that is something that they want, and obviously it's something that would go on their CV. They would create their portfolio to show that, you know, they've engaged with this. And then you get some more kind of co-design in terms of what goes on our modules. So it's not just us going, oh, this seems like the right way of doing it. It's actually them going, do you know what, that didn't quite fit right, but because of X, Y, and Z. So
I mean, that was a great idea, and thank you to Fiona for that, because we more or less stole that as well, actually. Not only did one of her iChampions join us on
peer-to-peer learning there.
Exactly. Peer-to-peer learning, a great exemplar of it. And we had one of her iChampions at a panel a few years ago, but also we now have a program of student ambassadors as well, who again are working on that peer-to-peer, making sure that students can have someone to go to ask about those questions they don't want to ask the academic, which is, I've forgotten my password, how do I actually get another one, or whatever it is. So those kind of things, we're building that program up now, definitely. And as Stuart mentioned, in some of the institutions where there are big digital implementations, institutions themselves are using third year students to help sort of mentor
I see it
tutor.
hugely across the institutions I travel to, and not just providing that support, so you've got third year supporting, but even in the choice of what digital resources they use. I forget the name. I was talking to an instructor at a particular institution. They have a panel of students, and any digital resource that's going to be used goes through the student panel, as well as all of the normal checking processes for implementing a digital tool. And that's growing. So I've kind of talked at events to other department heads and sort of said, is this stuff that's going on? And it's certainly something that's growing. They're saying it's not just a case of checking with IT and legal and all those kinds of people, but saying to the students, does this work for you? Does this make sense?
Do you actually want it?
Do you want it?
Because
this is going to add value.
We started by saying it's collaborative learning. It's not about us imposing education
it's an active
on the students. They are coming back and going, actually,
and that idea of a panel just works so well. And kind of brings students into that discussion that just doesn't seem to have happened as much in the past.
But that was one of the motivators, obviously, for this actual research, because it's all about student voices and about understanding what they're doing.
Bringing them into the centre of their own learning journey. So we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to pick out a couple more questions. Someone has asked about mobile usage. So I think it's a really interesting question. Mobile responsiveness is a huge issue in IT at the moment. A lot of students, especially in certain parts of the world, are a lot more likely to have access to a mobile phone than they are to a computer. So is that something that you guys are working on at the minute to make sure your resources are available in that format?
So yes, definitely. We already have a mobile app so for our core digital platforms, they're accessible. At this stage, not all of the things that you could do on a laptop or a desktop, for example, are necessarily there. And I think at this stage, it's a case of looking at what are we delivering? Does that work on mobile in its current format? Does it work on mobile at all? And I think that's one of the really key questions is there's lots of stuff you can do on mobile, whether you do it as an app, which for certain parts of the world works better than having a mobile responsive website.
Yeah.
But there are certain activities that you question at all. It's like, does that add value? Is it delivering it through a phone in its current format? Does that work? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
And I think at this stage it's moving in small stages. So it's, let's deliver something, let's see how it works, let's see how the students use it. And just generally because of the academic cycle. I mean, a testing period of looking at whether something works can be a whole year.
Yeah.
I mean, technology can move ridiculously quickly. Academia doesn't, just because of the nature of students studying. So it's a case of, let's implement something, let's look, let's see if it's being used. If it's not, why, and can we fix it, or is it just a bad idea? But certainly it's something there. We're conscious that in certain parts of the world, students don't have a device apart from their smartphone.
Yeah.
So it is more incumbent on us to be able to do more of that stuff in the right way. But it is a slow process by the nature of having to take time and assess, and there's no point in just delivering a set of tools and going, there you go, and hoping all of that stuff works.
The challenge in Africa particularly is data costs are very high.
Yeah.
So whilst the phones are ubiquitous, and in fact in South Africa I think there are 2 phones for every person. In South Africa about 85, 90 million phones.
Yeah.
Data is expensive.
Right.
So that's making sure also anything we deliver is delivered in a data efficient way. It's something we're looking at too in the future.
Sure, absolutely. And there are so many questions here, I'm just going to pick one more. How does technology deal with producing maths assessments and auto-grading short answer type questions?
Do you want to take that one?
Relatively well. Question. I mean, maths is one of the areas where, so our digital package tool that we deliver, it's called WebAssign. It's been around now for 10 years, started out of
MIT, or was it one of the large US universities?
It was a large US
North
university on the East
Carolina,
Coast, and I forget which one, but started there, was built by lecturers, instructors, in the first place educators, built it and ran the company for a long time. Cengage bought them out. It delivers tens of thousands of questions from basic mathematics through to calculus and algebra and everything in between. It allows randomization, allows students to have access to thousands of questions and multiple thousands of variations of questions in there. So actually it's one of the areas where you can, as a student, you can practice and practice and practice. And interestingly, because of that, in some of the geographic areas where because of the numbers of students and teaching faculty, digital hasn't necessarily always taken off, because you've got 10-to-1 teaching ratio, which is lovely, and you can do all that hands on the sport. They're still going, oh, this is the area that we need. We can't write 1,000 questions, we can't write 10,000 questions. So
that volume of content.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly maths, physics kind of area where, in a really simple way, digital scales fantastically well.
Yeah.
And the IA in those kind of products just enables that, as I was discussing earlier. You can give marks for the process, not necessarily the answer. So again, it's got that kind of technology around it. Short and long answer open questions, still a work in progress, to be honest. So a lot of it is around multiple choice and obviously closed answer questions.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I think we're out of time now, guys, but thank you once again for being here today to chat with me and chat with our audience. I've massively enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone out there has too. As Karen mentioned earlier, apologies, you were expecting to see Fiona Harvey here. I'm afraid she couldn't make it, but we're hoping to be able to get Fiona back at a later date to do something else. I'm sure we've got plenty more to talk about. This webinar has also been recorded in HD, so for any of you who would like to rewatch or share this content with anyone you think might find it interesting, it will be available to you afterwards. Once again, thank you for joining us. I'm Charlie Rogers from Education Technology. Thanks again to Cengage and your university, UCEM. I just completely fell out of my head. UCEM. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.